The morning broke with a hush, as though the prairie itself held its breath. A red wash of dawn spilled across the horizon, painting the sky in fire and rose. Wind brushed through tall grass, bending it in ripples like waves on a sleeping sea. From the east, a figure moved slowly, her small form silhouetted against the glowing light. She was young, 21 at most, carrying only a woven satchel slung across her shoulder. Each step was careful, measured, as if the earth beneath her were both home and burden. She was Apache, her dark hair long and heavy from the night dew, strands clinging to her cheek. Her dress was plain, patched and faded, yet her posture bore quiet strength. There was beauty in her stillness, though the world had taught her to hide it, to keep it guarded like embers under ash. She had walked through hardship for as long as memory allowed. Poverty was stitched into the hem of her clothes, loss tucked behind her steady eyes. She was not helpless, though many would call her so. She endured, and endurance was its own kind of power. Still, there was fragility to her, an unspoken ache, the ache of one who had been unseen for too long. That morning, she sought only water from the river ahead, nothing more than the quenching of thirst. Yet fate is seldom kind enough to let simple needs remain simple. From the west came the sound of hooves, sharp against the quiet earth. A horse, black-coated and broad, carried a man whose presence matched the strength of the beast he rode. He was 29, a cowboy born of wealth and ranching lineage. His clothes, though worn from use, spoke of quality. Leather boots, a sturdy hat, a coat lined against the bite of early autumn. His shoulders were wide, his frame weathered by labor, but never broken by want. To the townsfolk, he was strong, handsome, enviable. Yet beneath the surface, his heart bore loneliness, an emptiness masked by the privilege of inheritance and the illusion of certainty. He had lived surrounded by people, but rarely touched by understanding. Their paths converged at the river's bend, where sunlight struck water until it shimmered like scattered glass. She knelt first, dipping her hands to scoop the coolness, her reflection quivering on the surface. He arrived moments later, reining in his horse. The air tightened as if the world leaned closer to listen. She lifted her head, startled, her dark eyes meeting his. He did not speak. Neither did she. The silence pressed between them, thick and fragile, as though any word might shatter it. His gaze, steady but not unkind, held hers for longer than courtesy allowed. He swung down from his horse, movement slow, deliberate. From the leather strap at his side, he unfastened a canteen and extended it toward her. The gesture was simple, yet in it carried something unspoken. Recognition, perhaps even respect. She hesitated, suspicion flickering like a shadow across her face. Men had offered before, but rarely without price. Still, thirst outweighed fear. She reached for the canteen, her fingers brushing his as she took it. The brief contact startled them both, though neither let it show. She drank sparingly, then handed it back with a slight nod. Words remained absent, yet something deeper stirred, a seed of awareness, fragile and uncertain. The days that followed seemed to weave them into the same tapestry, though neither sought it. At the market, she bartered quietly for scraps of cloth. He stood nearby, trading cattle hides. Once, she paused to offer a piece of bread to a child who lingered hungry by the stalls. He watched, saying nothing, but remembered the way her hands trembled as though she herself had little enough to keep. Another time, she crouched by a stray dog, coaxing it with murmurs in her native tongue until its tail wagged, cautious but trusting. He saw the kindness in her, a softness not often granted space in the hard plains. And she, in turn, began to notice him, not the wealth that wrapped around him like armor, but the quieter truths. He repaired broken gates himself instead of waiting for hired hands. He spoke to his horse with a gentleness that did not match his imposing frame. He carried himself with strength, yes, but also restraint. Still, the distance between them was wide, measured not only in culture and circumstance, but in the unspoken walls each carried. She belonged to a people pushed to the edges, dismissed by those who considered themselves masters of the land. He belonged to a life of ownership, of control, though loneliness gnawed at the edges of his fortune. What could bridge such a divide? And yet, curiosity lingered, steady as the moon's return each night. One evening, as dusk softened the sky to violet, they crossed again near the ranch fence. She walked the boundary line, head bowed, tracing the horizon with her eyes as though searching for something lost. He approached from horseback, slowing as he neared. Words rose in his throat but faltered, for what could he say that would not sound hollow? She did not move away. Instead, she stood still, the distance between them shrinking to little more than breath. In the fading light, he saw the quiet defiance in her gaze, the unspoken message that she would not bow, would not vanish into invisibility. He respected it, even as it unsettled him. He touched the brim of his hat in a silent gesture and rode on, the echo of the moment clinging like dust in his chest. The prairie carried whispers at night, and in those whispers lay the beginnings of conflict. Rumors of unrest drifted through town, murmurs of ranchers blaming tribes for stolen cattle, of settlers speaking harshly of those who walked the land before them. The Apache woman felt it in the wary glances cast her way, the tightened shoulders when she passed. The cowboy heard it in the saloon, where men spoke boldly of defending their property with force if need be. Both knew storms gathered, though neither could yet see their full weight. And both knew, deep within, that their fragile recognition of each other might not survive the turning of that storm. Yet even so, something pressed them forward. Curiosity had become awareness. Awareness, perhaps, was on its way to something else. As the night deepened, stars spilling endless across the sky, she sat by the embers of her fire, remembering the touch of his hand as he offered the canteen. He lay in his ranch house, the bracelet she left at the fence resting in his memory, though it had not yet been woven. In the stillness, both wondered the same unspoken thought. What happens when two worlds collide not in violence, but in tenderness? Neither had the answer yet, but both felt the question shaping the path ahead. The prairie winds shifted then, carrying with them the faint sound of distant riders. Hooves struck the earth like a warning drum, heavy and relentless. She looked up from her fire, heart quickening, eyes fixed on the horizon. He, too, rose from his bed, the echo of the sound stirring unease in his chest. Somewhere between them, in the vastness of the land, fate was already choosing its course. And though neither yet knew it, the choices of others would soon press them closer than either had dared imagine. Autumn drifted across the prairie like a hymn, soft golden lights spilling over the land and settling on every stalk of grass, every weary homestead roof. The air carried a faint crispness, a promise of colder nights to come. She moved through this shifting season quietly, her steps careful yet certain, her hands busy with small tasks for neighbors who accepted her help but rarely her presence. It was in these small kindnesses she carved her place in a world that had little intention of making room for her. And it was in these moments that he, the cowboy with broad shoulders and quiet eyes, found himself watching her more than he ever admitted aloud. One afternoon, he stood at the side of a weathered wagon, its wheel cracked by time. His hands, steady and sure, worked at the broken spokes, while the widow, who owned it, hovered nearby, worried about the winter journey ahead. She appeared then, the young Apache woman, arms full of damp linens she carried for the same widow. Her hair caught the sunlight, strands glinting like black fire. She glanced once at him, a glance so swift it might have been mistaken for nothing, yet in it lingered acknowledgment. She moved past without a word, hanging the linens along a line that trembled in the wind. The silence between them stretched taut, yet not uncomfortable, as though both had accepted it as the language they shared. He fixed the wheel, she hung the cloth, and the widow, though grateful, did not see the deeper thread weaving slowly between them. The first true breach of distance came with the storm. Clouds gathered thick and heavy, thunder rolling across the plains like a drumbeat of warning. She had taken the hands of two children, neighbors kin entrusted to her for the evening, and was guiding them along the path toward shelter when the rain began to fall. The wind whipped hard, driving water into their faces. She bent low, shielding the little ones with her body, urging them forward though her own steps faltered. From the rise of the hill came the cowboy astride his black horse, rain slicking his coat to his frame. He slowed as he drew near, his voice raised over the storm. He offered space beneath his horse's blanket, extending a hand toward her and the children. She froze, torn between caution and need. But the children shivered, frightened. And she saw no cruelty in his eyes, only steadiness. She placed their small hands in his, then stepped under the shelter with them. For a brief while, as rain beat the earth into mud, they huddled together in the shadow of his horse, strangers bound by necessity. When the storm broke and they parted, there were no words, only the faintest nod exchanged before each walked away. Something shifted after that night. She began to see him not only as a figure of wealth and strength, but as someone capable of gentleness. And he, in turn, saw her endurance not as a mask of helplessness, but as quiet courage. Yet the prairie was not kind enough to leave such understanding untested. At a gathering in town, when lanterns lit the night and music drifted from a fiddle, the air grew sour with a careless remark. A man, drunk and eager to wound, spoke crudely of her heritage, his words sharp enough to still the laughter around him. She stood frozen, heat rising in her cheeks, shame pressed upon her by eyes that turned to watch. Before fists could fly or she could walk away, the cowboy stepped forward. His voice cut through the crowd, low and firm, not a shout, but a command. He spoke of respect, of dignity, of words that had no place among decent folk. His tone carried such weight that the drunkard, though scowling, lowered his gaze. She said nothing, her pride unwilling to appear weak before many eyes, but later that night, under cover of quiet, she left a small hand-woven bracelet upon his fence post. It was the only thank you she could bear to give. When he found it at dawn, the threads died in muted earth tones, his breath caught. He tucked it inside his coat, near his heart, and carried it with him wherever he went. It was not a token of possession, but of trust, and that knowledge made it heavier than gold. In the days that followed, their conversations began, small and tentative. They did not speak of dreams, for dreams were too tender, nor of love, for love was too bold. Instead, they spoke of ordinary things, the fickleness of weather, the stubbornness of cattle, the price of flour in the market. Yet in those simple words, intimacy grew. He learned she loved the sound of rain against canvas, a comfort from nights spent wandering. She learned he cherished the distant strains of a fiddle drifting through dark, a reminder that even the loneliest evenings could be softened by song. These were not secrets, but they were truths, and truths shared become threads that bind. As autumn deepened, he found reasons to linger where she walked. She, though wary of gossip, no longer turned away when he approached. Still, the world around them sharpened. The whispers in town grew louder. Talk of ranchers losing cattle, of tribes accused without proof, of tensions stoked by fear more than fact. She felt the weight of those stares that followed her, suspicion pressing heavy against her spine. He heard men mutter that kindness toward her kind was weakness, that a man of his stature ought not waste his notice on such company. Each carried these burdens quietly, unwilling yet to speak of them aloud, but aware that their fragile bond might soon be tested in fire. One evening, when the air was sharp with the scent of burning leaves, he walked the edge of the prairie and found her seated by a small fire. She did not rise as he approached, nor did she bid him leave. He lowered himself opposite her, letting the flames flicker between them. The silence was not awkward, only alive with things unsaid. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a piece of dried meat, placing it by the flames, and without looking at him, nudged half toward his side. He accepted it, not with words, but with the quiet gravity of one who understood the gesture's weight. They ate in silence, the stars stretching endless above, each bite a step closer to something unnamed. When the fire dimmed, he spoke at last, his voice soft. He told her of a time he was young, how he had once feared the dark, how his father had told him that stars were not far lights, but holes torn in heaven so that loved ones might look down. She listened, her expression unreadable, then whispered that her people, too, believed the night sky was alive, each star the spirit of a story never lost. For a moment, the vast divide between them narrowed into nothing. 2 lives, 2 worlds, and 1 sky shared like breath. The night ended, But the question lingered. They parted with no promises, no plans, yet the silence between them now thrummed with possibility. He returned to his ranch, the bracelet heavy in his coat, his heart unsteady with a new kind of longing. She walked back to her dwelling, the memory of his voice still echoing like a low song across the prairie. Both knew the world around them would not soften, that conflict brewed close, but both also knew that something had begun, something worth braving. And as the wind rose, carrying with it the faint sound of distant riders once more, she lifted her head sharply, sensing that what approached would change everything. Winter crept upon the prairie like a silent tide, laying its white breath across the earth until the grasses bowed beneath frost. The sky was pale and endless, the kind of sky that made a person feel both small and eternal at once. She moved through this cold world with her shawl drawn tight, gathering wood with fingers stiff from chill. The air burned her lungs, but she pressed on, her steps steady despite the weight she carried. Halfway along the trail, she faltered, the bundle slipping from her arms. When she bent to lift it again, another set of hands reached down. He stood beside her, snow clinging to his coat, his breath rising in steady clouds. Without a word, he took half the load and shouldered it. They walked on together, the silence between them no longer distant but companionable, like two travelers who had walked this same path in countless lifetimes. The days grew harsher. Rumors swept across the town with the bitter wind. Smallpox whispered at the edge of settlements, sickness spreading like unseen fire. Fear stiffened men's voices, and suspicion turned sharper still. She watched the children of her people fall weak, fever rising, lips parched. Medicine was scarce, withheld by traders who valued coin more than mercy. One evening, as the cold gnawed deepest, she stood outside her dwelling, helpless before the cries of the ill. And then he came, his horse lathered from a ride, his arms heavy with parcels wrapped in cloth. Bottles of tonic, herbs, bandages, medicine bought with the weight of his own purse. He did not wait for thanks. He simply handed them over, his face lined with resolve. She stared, astonished, her throat thick with words she could not form. In that moment, she saw him not as a wealthy cowboy, nor as a man set apart, but as one willing to step into fire for her people. Her heart, long guarded, opened like frost cracking under dawn. The nights that followed were filled with long hours at the bedsides of the sick. She ground herbs, cooled fevers, whispered songs her mother had once sung. He came too, awkward at first, his hands more used to reins than bandages, yet learning as he went. He held water to lips, lifted frail bodies with surprising tenderness. Together, they kept vigil, two souls weaving their strength for the sake of others. Somewhere amid the labored breaths of the ill and the dim glow of lanterns, something unspoken passed between them. It was not a declaration, not yet, but the knowledge that they had entered a place of trust, so deep it no longer required proof. When the sickness waned and children began to laugh again, she found him one dusk by the frozen river. He stood staring at the sheet of ice, his hat low, as though waiting. She approached softly, her breath visible in the cold. For a long while they said nothing, only listened to the groan of ice shifting beneath. Then he spoke, his voice low, carrying weight. He told her he had kept the bracelet she had left, that it had never left his side. His hand brushed the pocket of his coat where it lay, worn now from touch. She felt her chest tighten, tears pressing behind her eyes though she fought them back. She whispered that she had believed herself invisible, destined to walk unseen through the world. His gaze turned to her then, steady and unwavering. He said he had seen her from the first, not as broken, not as shadow, but as brave. Their hands brushed, fingers trembling, and for a moment the world seemed to still. In the silence of that winter dusk, love revealed itself, not sudden, not loud, but certain. But the prairie was never free of conflict. Tensions that had brewed in whispers finally cracked into shouts. A stolen herd, accusations traded like bullets, settlers and tribes standing on the edge of violence. He rode into town to hear men planning retaliation, their anger fanned by fear and pride. She heard the same from her people, voices rising with the memory of too many wounds. Both knew blood would be spilled unless something broke the tide. That evening, when lanterns lit the gathering place, he stepped forward alone. His voice, calm yet firm, cut through the heated air. He spoke not of sides, but of lives, of children who would be left fatherless, of women who would bury more than they could bear. Men muttered, some scornful, yet none could deny the steadiness of his words. And then she appeared, stepping from the shadows, her shawl drawn close, but her eyes alight with resolve. She stood beside him, silent but unyielding, her presence a mirror of his courage. The moment hung like a held breath. Here was the cowboy, wealthy and strong, risking his standing to defend peace. Here was the Apache woman, poor and often dismissed, standing tall, beside him where all could see. For a heartbeat, the world did not know whether to scorn or to listen. And then a quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, not agreement, not yet, but the recognition that perhaps anger was not the only path. The two of them, side by side, became a vision neither side could ignore, proof that trust was possible, that tenderness might be stronger than pride. When the meeting broke and the crowd dispersed, he reached for her hand, not hidden, not secret, but in the open air. She did not pull away. Instead, her fingers curled into his, steady as stone. Around them, silence spread, heavy with astonishment. For the first time, their bond was not shadow but flame, visible to all. He felt the eyes upon them, the weight of judgment, but none of it mattered. In that moment, only her hand in his held meaning. Later, as dawn stretched pale across the prairie, they rode together side by side. Snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves, breath rising in clouds. She leaned slightly toward him, not in weakness, but in trust, her dark eyes soft with a light he had never seen before. He turned to her, and for the first time, he allowed himself to smile fully, without restraint. It was a smile not of conquest, not of pride, but of love, gentle, fierce, unbreakable. The world would not suddenly grow kind. They both knew trials lay ahead, that whispers would turn into gossip, and gossip into challenge. But they also knew this. They had chosen one another, and that choice was stronger than fear. As the horizon stretched endless before them, their silhouettes cut against the rising sun, two riders who had defied the odds. And though their journey was only beginning, their hearts beat with a certainty that carried them forward. Far behind, unseen by either, the same distant riders who once thundered like a warning drum now rode again, their figures small against the winter plain. Whether they brought danger or deliverance remained hidden in the cold air. But one truth was already certain. Their love had become something neither time nor storm could unmake. And that truth would be tested sooner than either dared to dream.